I'd like to thank the museum very much to have invited me. And so there are 30 minutes, and the topic I like to talk about is rather personal, is the museum as a time machine. It's not science fiction. It is a real kind of understanding as somebody who is a passionate visitor of museums. And I'm an amateur. I'm not an art historian, and I have never worked in a museum after university and then within a hierarchy kind of eventually becoming director. I was asked to become director of the Museum Ludwig in Cologne because it was a museum in a very crisis situation. The mother, the Wallraf Richards Museum, it's a museum of 14th century art going into the 19th century. They had a very strange kind of understanding where is modernism, where is contemporary art. So basically there are 4 fantastic paintings of Munch, which left with the mother, and I felt these paintings should have been with the Museum Ludwig because there were 2 of them psychologically extremely modern, even though he was born prior to 1875. So that's like history. That's how geography quite often is being made by political rules which have nothing to do with languages, organic cultures. So it's a kind of a very factual momentum. The advantage was I was being asked because I had been involved in a very big exhibition which I proposed to the city of Cologne in the 80s. And that exhibition was called Westkunst. And the title was from Laszlo Glose. Oh yeah, that's good. A Hungarian who left Budapest when the Russians came there in the 50s. And he was actually a musician, and he had a chance to study in Freiburg in Germany through a connection of his father. And then he visited art history lectures because that's how he could learn German. They were showing pictures. And so when I was being asked to do this exhibition, I felt it was significant to talk about 39, which means the beginning of the war. And Laszlo, who was sort of an intellectual friend, I asked him to join me, and we worked on it together. And it was an exhibition dealing with 39 and what happened after that. So Europe suddenly became East Europe, Central Europe, and it was all because of the Cold War, communism, capitalism, and so on. So I just say this briefly because we had also confrontational momentums from 39, and 39 meant all modern movements had died out. It was sort of a kind of situation where the Russians were into neo-colonialism and neoclassicism in terms of architecture. Stalin had been in ruling, suppressing all avant-garde movements. The same went on more or less in France. The vitality of modernism had sort of come down. And Jean Hébert showed 2 images of the exhibition he did in Düsseldorf. One with Albers and one with a Dutch, I think 18th century painter, and they had some kind of familiarity. We did something similar in a relatively small room of 2 painters. One was Edward Hopper. From the 60s, there were 4 medium-sized paintings of a gas station, of a kind of American individualism, of a certain kind of loneliness, but it had very, very, very strong connotations in post-war Germany. There was a dream of America, but there was also a fear of America. So most people thought these paintings only existed as posters. They had seen them as posters, but they have not known that even a poster needs an image to make a poster from. And Albers, who had left in the early 30s with his wife, who was Jewish, but he somehow sensed that he wanted to go to America. He became a great, great pedagogue, and he had been at the Bauhaus. And the people who liked Albers did not even take Hopper series and vice versa. So the confrontation for me was always one which I physically experienced as a kid, growing up with my brothers and sisters, post-war, post-Nazi time. So, for instance, I visited a lot Holland, going to Stedelijk Museum, and my prime interest was film, because film, you could see film in Holland without dubbing it. There were subtitles. I would go to antiquarian bookshops, and they would have literature which was forbidden in the Nazi time, but published in Amsterdam and other places. So it was a kind of different way of understanding a kind of globalism, trying to deal with your own traumatic kind of past, but looking forward. So art became quite significant. It didn't need translation, and it was sort of open if you were interested. So because of this Westkunst thing, I ended up at the Museum Ludwig, and I could tell them, I only do it if you get me so and so many young people to work with. I don't want to have places outside of Cologne, because maybe there are areas where poor people live and you want to educate them, or Turkish areas, and said, no, we let them come into the museum. We don't go there, they come to the museum. So the idea, that's why I'm showing this picture. Here you see the cathedral, and there you see the trains. So Cologne was very significant in the 60s, 70s. Now it's just another kind of hub provincial town of the Rhineland, but it has lost its momentum in regard to visual art. Like in the 60s, 70s, it suddenly became a kind of a center by itself. It's an ugly city, but it's a very kind of interesting local city. But it doesn't have the strength to be more than what it is. So the art scene in the 60s, 70s suddenly became magic, but it was only a fluke. Anyway, this big museum was built. It's not great architecture, but it's very practical. And after I had been there for 12, oh, I see, this were the images. I thought this was for the time. Oh, yeah. So, so when I came, actually Jean Bear and I, our kind of biographies have crossed paths, because I worked for Pontus Hultén in Stockholm long time ago, and then he became a colleague of yours in Paris. And I took an idea from Stockholm, but I made something completely different out of it. The beginning exhibition was called Museum unserer Wünsche, a museum of our wishes. Our, in lowercase in German, means the people working in the museum and the people visited the museum. So it's a kind of a cooperation. And a good idea, I stole it also. It was from an artist, and she said, make it like a fairy tale. So the works we showed from the collection, which were very dear to me, many of them hadn't been shown for years, had a neutral white logo. Then those we wanted to acquire had a silver logo. And those which have been acquired had a golden logo. So it was kind of a game. You go somewhere, look at an exhibition, and say, which picture would you take home, right? Irregardless of its value. For instance, the Museum of Modern Art had a show before they moved into their new building. They had 100 works, and it was quite clearly, it was just marvelous. It was so fantastic. Which work would you take home? Matisse, Picasso? So I ended up taking home a whole ensemble of Brancusi. I mean, just a game. But it was important as a game. For instance, these are works of Raoul de Keyser, a Flemish painter. Wonderful painter, very, very very ingrained in the history of painting, but odd, curious, and very fragile. And the museum ended up with 5 paintings. So the very I think it's very important that a museum has to stay autonomous. And if you have sponsors, fine, but then they have to sponsor the museum, and they should not sponsor works which is good for advertisement. So the idea of the Museum of Our Wishes was a good way of entering. And my style, because it was interesting, and I hope we can have a discussion, is a very confrontational one. So when I left after 12 years, I said, now I want to make an exhibition which is basically against my grain, because it deals with a certain emotional momentum in relationship to art, and with a kind of art which I personally have to a great extent avoided, because it was very, the aesthetic experience can be overly difficult to deal with. So it's a kind of humanistic, strange momentum which I basically have avoided. And Vor dem Gesetz is a short story of Kafka. Most of them, you probably know it. And it's a very, very, very cruel, absurd, and wonderful story. There is the law, and everybody can go and visit the law. And the law has somebody who is in front of the law, and somebody comes in from the country and says, I want to visit the law. And the guard says, yes, you can visit the law, but not now. So all of his life, he goes and visits the law, and he's always told, yes, you can visit the law, but not now. So the law, obviously, was completely real, and the missing of law right after the Second World War. I don't know. So this Kafka story was also quoted a lot, in existentialism by Camus and Sartre and so on, but it was very much a basis of trying to refigure where does the society go, and how was it possible to have been dealt with these extraordinary mass murder kind of cruelties. And I had seen a presentation of Jimmy Durham im Haus der Kulturen in Berlin, and it's called Building a Nation. And he had 12 chapters with a kind of bric-a-brac stuff where he quoted famous Americans, Mark Twain, Abraham Lincoln, different writers, politicians, military people, dealing with the American Indians. And this quote, the only good Indians I ever saw were dead, is basically running through all of these quotes. Some people being very educational and saying we are trying to make them into individuals. They should own property. They should have family life. They should not be tribal anymore. They should become citizens and so on. But if they don't want to, we are forced to get rid of them. So there was a kind of, it's not interesting, maybe as art, but it is very interesting when you are confronted with certain situations which look like run-down housing, but they still have a fireplace, or they still have a kind of a car which is being kind of derelict, but is being used as a kind of refrigerator or whatever. So it is a kind of Tanguy Nouveau Realism aesthetics, but behind it, it is very hard and absolutely crucial when you begin to appreciate certain things, and then it's not nice, it's not beautiful. It's but it transforms itself because of its intelligence of making a scene which is theatrical and explains it in a historical context. So then the decision was made, a pretty lonely decision, but since I stopped I was going to stop being a director, I said, okay, in the end, I'm not going to be so collegial. I do now exactly what I want, and then I leave, and I really leave. And that is, I took down the whole prior top floor, which was made really for painting, and said, we want to show sculpture, which is very physical, very space-oriented, from the early 50s, when even at that time there wasn't so much material available. And it was dealing, for instance, with this work which I've always liked, of Germain Richier, but put it up, and put it up high, so it is like a gargoyle of the cathedral. Put it up like in medieval, make it a totem, make it for what it is. It's cruel, and it gives you a kind of a sense of insecurity. Then, Giacometti has come up a number of times, and this foot of Giacometti was made 12 years after he made the hand and all these body parts, and it's much larger than the others. It's from a neighboring museum, so we spend a lot of time going around and looking at the things physically, not looking at reproductions as you do now, but physically. For instance, this is a monument which was never realized by Dürer from 500 years ago, and that was a very ambivalent monument, which you are not sure is this in favor of the farmers in Bauernkrieg during the Reformation, or is he basically making fun of the farmers and siding with the winners. This was a topic in sociology and history and art history in the 60s very, very much. And this artist made a work where you see the actual drawing of Dürer, but there the farmer has been stabbed in the back. Now it's the artist himself who sits up there, who is very disinterested. He's looking into the landscape. He's smoking dope. You wonder, how did he get up there? So it is something where a certain generation says, hey, what is this? A war. That's not me. That's not my generation. That's not my physical experience. That became interesting in a context of 500 years before, and that is something everybody somehow can identify with it, because it's more kind of a comic, and it explains itself, even though we didn't want any kind of educational introduction, but be confronted directly with the physical of itself. For instance, this work, The Carousel of Bruce Nauman, it's from the museum in The Hague. There are maquettes for stuffing animals in America, a bear, coyote, and so on. And he puts them on the angle. The earlier works of Nauman, where he worked with chairs, which is basically about torture. But here, it's very much sound, brutal sound, because you hear these animals being stretched over the floor. It's a very quirky, brutal sound. And you see figurative momentum, which is kind of cinematographic, and at the same time, it's definitely a physical attack on bodies, right? But quite a lot of people in the museum also recommend it and recognize it as Bruce Nauman. So there's a quote of him where he says, I want to make art like hitting somebody over the head without that person noticing it, saying the truth, but not doing kitsch, transforming it, okay? So that was a kind of quirking, unpleasant sound through the museum. Okay, Thomas Schütter, quite well-known German artist, who is very influenced by Oldenburg and Naumann, and who is a sort of post-minimalist generation, now going into figure, even though he started out very differently. And this is called Vaterstaat. So Vaterstaat means father state, the state which can be benevolent, but can also rule, makes a law and say no, right? So, I mean, you know much better now what Vaterstaat is than what Germany presently is discussing. They don't really, they're kind of uncertain about it. So again, I think democracy is also a time machine. It is very important not to know what it is, but to ask questions what it can be. How useful can it be as a transmission momentum? The idea of discussing a museum, the museums is something which has to be done within the museum itself and not by others. And that means you need a public, and you educate the public on the highest possible level so they understand beauty and contradiction. So this man, very stark, it relates to German philosophy and theater and so on. That would go to choir. But it has this, no arms, but it has this very unpleasant authority, but it is also interesting as a sculpture. Not only because it's big, but it has this rusty sculpture. It's kind of in a material you would associate at the Museum Ludwig in connection with Richard Serra. But it's not with imposing kind of macho strengths. It is more questioning this steel material, which is rusty. Okay. Obviously, the Latin was the essential kind of momentum for the exhibition. Rotterdam was completely wiped out by the Wehrmacht, by the Germans, because it was the most important port in Europe outside of and then the Germans bombed it and occupied it and so on. So it was totally wiped out. Oh yeah. And this has this kind of pathos of the dead city. Because when a city like Rotterdam is completely wiped out, or Dresden, it doesn't ask who wiped it out. Then history is gone. Then momentums of memory are so wiped out. So this is, in fact, when a city is completely destroyed, in a way it's even more cruel than when people are being destroyed, because there will be new people maybe. That is something unpopular to say. But if you erase memory, then you are then there is no future, so to speak. So this work had this kind of incredible pathos right after the war, and then, Wirtschaftswunder began and so on. Again, we put it relatively up high, and there you see a fantastic sculpture, which I had never, ever thought of wanting to show, and that is Fritz Krämer. He was a communist. He comes from Dortmund. It's very much in the tradition of French sculpture, Lehmbruck, Mayol, and so on. But then he was a communist, and he was in a special battalion during the war, where the chances for him to survive was very small. However, he was very committed in all of his sculptural work as a sculptor, traditional sculptor, to deal with the Holocaust and the Nazi time. And Bert Brecht made this amazing poem in 1933, Bleiche Mutter Deutschland, Pale Mother Germany, which was saying, with the advent of the Nazis, there will be a war. Think about the mothers, all the mothers will be pale because they're losing their sons. It's a kind of Käthe-Kollwitz connection and so on. And then Fritz Krämer made this after the war, and this is in a concentration camp in Mauthausen in Austria, and the piece itself is in the Nationalgalerie in Berlin and hadn't been shown in West Berlin for 25 years. It's now only that it happened. So, as you can see, there were 11 sculptors and then 11, 12 artists, contemporary artists, who made special contribution to the exhibition, but they were not sculptors. They just did whatever they wanted to do. And this is a work which existed before, but he adopted it. So of Paul Chen, it's an 8-hour work which has a kind of computer-oriented program which always changes. And it goes from a kind of sad situation of squirking and fucking and pushing, and then becomes abstract. And what it also always should be presented in the context of the room in itself and not in a neutral room. So this, in our case, we had these great paintings of Sigmar Polke, and with the understanding of the artist, we turned them around, and it was on these paintings. Again, for the Museum Ludwig, it was quite important to know what had been in these rooms before, at least for us, and inherently also, I think, for the public. Now, Pavel Althammer, who I had met in Aachen, I think he got a prize there, and I said, why don't you come by? And he liked the idea of going over the Rhine, going to the east, because there was always this saying right after the war of the West German Republic, Siberia begins on the other side of the Rhine, right? That was sort of Adenauer politics. And he said he wanted to have this, the Wizard of Oz going to Warsaw. And next to the Pavel Althammer piece, there is a group of photographs of Candida Höfer, of the citizens of Calais, of Rodin. And there are 12 places all over the world where they are presented. And for instance, here you see a group of Chinese tourists in London. And this is really interesting because these figures were very close on the ground, and they had this immediate kind of contact to the audience. Now, this room, which oversees the area in front of the museum and the bridge going over to the Rhine, that was a room where they had sculptures of Judd, where we had paintings of Ken Noland and Maurice Lewis. There was work of a kind of American work from the 60s, and very, very factual, very direct, and of great quality. That's important. Now, Carla Black, who was also invited in St. Petersburg, and where it was not successful because it had to be closed, picked this big room, and it was just an empty room, but she transformed the room into something very fragile, very sensitive, and at the same time almost childlike, you know, like children who are in this age between 2 and 4, where they have this clear consciousness, where they can grasp things, not all of them, but some, which is extraordinary, almost visionary. So it has this touchy, it's just pink and blue, and it's sort of children's birthday, but it's very cosmic, but not sentimental. Oh, yeah. So now, the time machine, now it became interesting. 2 years later, there was an internal competition by the Manifesta, and they asked people with museums experience, but primarily people who had made exhibitions, but had museums experience, to make a proposal for the 250 years birthday of the Hermitage in connection to this wandering biennale. And I was very excited because for me, you know, it was like St. Petersburg, Leningrad, film, revolution, even though I'd never been there, but I thought I knew quite a lot about it, but I also knew how magic this fantastic museum is, and then I experienced it as a palace, which made it even more interesting, and I made a proposal, pretty clear proposal, and on one hand, super pragmatic, really as somebody who had experience with a museum, and I said, if you are using a new building, then you have to have a big attraction which goes into that building, so people who come, tourists from all over the world who want to see the Hermitage, have to go there, because otherwise, if it's contemporary, they won't come. And my wish immediately was Matisse, because the two key paintings, one, the dance, and the other one, the music, are the base of our culture, much more important than visual art. Music, because it's collective, and dance, right? It's very important for survival. It's very important for understanding, to be by yourself and to be with others. And where do you come from? Where do you go? And then there was a question which was interesting. Why not Picasso? Because they have often equal momentum, great paintings from that period. I mean, just amazingly good. And I was pushed very hard to give an answer, and because there was a great audience of fantastic, art historians from all parts of this fantastic museum. I was pushed so hard that I said, oh, but Jesus is, no, not Jesus. Jesus is Picasso. Matisse is Buddha. So that is an answer which I gave under the pressure of being in a world museum, right? And then a lot of misunderstandings happened because my prime interest was to connect of some kind into the fantastic history of Russian constructivism, and maybe 3 generations later who learned from it, or who at least had a kind of awareness of it, not just because it was in Russia, but in their own inherent work. And Sergei Fofanov, I'm very happy also to be here because he's a fantastic colleague. We work together, and he's now at the Trentino Gallery. And he will, 30 minutes is not enough. It would need 30 hours to talk about it. However, one of the basic ideas was that these rooms of Matisse would be made empty. Matisse would go into the General Staff building, and 3 women, all great painters, would replace it. So one was Maria Lasnik, the other one was Marlene Dumas, and Nicole Eisenman. And that became rather difficult because they say, yeah, but people expect Matisse there, and something. Yeah, that's true. But you advertise it that it's now in the other building. It's worthwhile to go there. It's a huge building. It's a little bit pompous. It's a little bit oversized. It's a little bit too much like very important. However, it's a reality. No. I think it's the ghost of the Eremitage. I'm still on time? Yeah. So, I hope that the Eremitage will exist more or less as it is for the next 200 years. Culturally, it's very significant. If you change things all the time, and a museum is something which is static and needs change, but the change should be an emotional, intellectual one. It should not be a physical one. If you go to the Prado now, and you want to go into the entrance, and you know Goya is on the right, the feudal painter is on the left, no, you have to go through the kitchen, because that's where there's a store, where they sell you stuff, where you buy postcards, where you buy shawls, where you buy something, and you enter the museum on the wrong side, and you don't understand it. So I think a museum is a time machine in a negative and in a positive way, but one needs the other. The dialectics of a museum, it's very significant. The Museum of Modern Art, for instance, they have now a room with Cézanne, with Mademoiselle d'Avignon from Picasso, and this has no glass. You can see the painting without reflection. And it's the icon of the museum, so this saves them. But basically, the museum is bound to be arrogant. It's the Vatican, and it's the Kremlin of modern art. So they can only protect what they have because they decide what is art. And they should have stopped collecting 10, 20 years ago, and a new thing should happen. So I'm very conservative in one sense, and I'm very radical in the other sense. So I think art needs always, each generation has to look what is significant for them. And they should never give up the idea of quality, because the quality is something like in music, in philosophy and so on, which survives. That makes hope. And people are not stupid. They have a great potential if you give them the chance to be on that level. So I wish, the Pushkin and the Tretyakov great futures. And I think it's interesting when certain identities remain. And so, again, thank you for the invitation, and I hope we can discuss.